technical thing. Awesome. All right, everybody. Hi, I'm Paul Grand. I am the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. MedTech Innovator is an accelerator. So we focus on finding the most interesting and most compelling companies all over the world. We want to make sure that these companies are successful. And what we do in the life science space is we find the companies that we believe are going to be the most important companies in healthcare, and we partner them up with some of the leading strategics, service providers, government agencies, and others in healthcare who we believe can help them bring their products to market. And as part of our accelerator program, we have a weekly webinar series that runs here on YouTube Live. You are able to join in on these conversations. There's a little chat box. If you look over there in the corner, you can enter in your questions. One of my team members will relay them to me. I'll try and get them answered in this first hour. At the end of the hour, we're going to have a 30-minute Q&A just with the companies that are part of the MedTech Innovator cohort. So that's just for them. But if you want to get your questions in now, please go ahead and submit those or during this discussion. So today we're going to be talking about human-centered value propositions. And we'll unpack what that even means in a moment. But generally speaking, design is a huge part of what all of us do in our development process in medtech, in health tech, and maybe in anything these days. And we've always heard, maybe over the last several years, we hear people talk about human-centered design. And there's a component of that, which is human-centered value propositions. Value props are everything in healthcare. We're going to talk about what this even means in a moment. But I like to always say that the value proposition is the new elevator pitch. But again, the value proposition can be different for different stakeholders, and we're going to get into that today a little bit. So the goal today is to learn something that you can take with you to help you in your process, wherever you are in your development, whether you're a super early company, a late stage company. There should hopefully be some nuggets today that you can take with you, and you can go back to somebody and say like, hey, we're not doing it right. Or maybe we should stop and we should rethink something based on what you hear today. That's my hope, at least. So let me introduce our expert panelists for today. We've got two terrific people who are joining us from Ximedica, which has been a longtime partner of MedTech Innovator. They get very deep with some of our companies each year during the program, meaning that they mentor companies directly in the program. They have mentored winners of MedTech Innovators competitions that we have at the end of the program very proudly. And those companies have said like that the Ximedica team was transformative for them. So that's why we have them here, to bring their expertise to you. So let me start off and introduce our two panels for today. I'm going to start off with Kate MacNamee, who's Director of Design Research at Ximedica. So Kate, tell us a little bit about yourself, about Ximedica, what you do for the company.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Paul. So as Paul said, my name is Kate MacNamee, and my background is predominantly academically in cognitive neuroscience. But as I've become more and more applied in my role and in my job, I've really been able to take the human-centered aspect of neuroscience and apply it to medical device design. I've been a consultant for the last decade, essentially, and that has been entirely in medical devices. So I have a lot of experience with everything from implants and auto-injectors all the way up to surgical robotics and artificial intelligence. So really trying to span the full spectrum of products, and happy to help you guys as a cohort understand how to think about human limitations and cognitive capacity when you are designing your products.
Very important. And even why healthcare personally? I mean, there's lots of fields you could be in. You could be doing this in automotive or something else. Why healthcare?
Yeah, that is a great point. I actually did start off in autonomous vehicle work, and I transitioned to healthcare. I think the pitch that everyone says is, you want to be doing something meaningful. You want to make a difference in people's lives. And I think that's true for all of us. But ultimately, healthcare for me was something that had the most interesting problems to solve. And so in addition to being, humanitarian, in addition to wanting to make positive impact on a national or international scale, I think there was also just the idea that the problems you were solving, my interest in biology and anatomy, combined for a really fascinating set of problems to work through with our clients. And that's why consulting has been so fun, because again, the variety of problem and the value of solving those problems has been so high.
Terrific. Well, I'm glad you're staying in this field. Don't leave.
Yes,
all right.
Absolutely.
Well, let's move on then to our second panelist. So Mike Neidert, who's VP of Strategic Development on the West Coast for Ximedica. Mike, same questions for you. Tell us about yourself, background, and more about Ximedica if you'd like.
Sure. Mike Neidert, as Paul said, I'm the VP of Strategic Development on the West Coast for Ximedica. That basically means that I manage our West Coast business, and I work with our partner companies to scope out the work at the beginning, and then I usually stick along on our projects as sort of an internal business consultant. And my role is a lot more business focused, whereas Kate's on the front lines on design and the research efforts that inform the design. And one of the ways that we love to work together, I think, where the synergies come in, is really trying to think holistically about products and making sure that the business model, the go-to-market model, lines up with the design, right? And there's a lot of things to think about strategically, both on the design side, but then also how you're going to access markets and go to markets. So there's a lot in terms of how we work with our partner companies in trying to think holistically about how this is going to get into the hands of physicians. It's going to get onto shelves in the hospitals, et cetera. My background, so I've spent my entire career in medicine. I got my PhD in biomedical engineering and moved right into Medtronic. So I was with Medtronic for 15, 16 years initially as an engineer, but then I moved over into strategy. So I've been involved on the design side, but then also on the go-to-market side and the market planning side for things like drug-eluting stents, renal denervation, pacing leads, navigation systems, a pretty broad swath of medical devices.
So you're in it for the long haul, it sounds like. You're in it. All right. That's great. Good. So, and just again, like functionally, are you guys on the same team? Do you, as you said, I know you're coming to a different part of the process, but how do you guys even work together? Do you continue to work together during a project?
Yeah, absolutely. So what often happens is that Mike will bring me in when we realize that a client has a need for research, sometimes whether the client knows it or not. Mike will pull me in and say, hey, we've got someone that you should talk to, and we got to figure out where our capabilities overlap with their needs. And so we'll start off well before the program even begins, working together to figure out, either what the client knows they need and how we can achieve that, or what they may not yet be sure they need and how we can help them understand that need in a way that's not too salesy, essentially. So Mike and I will work together on those types of proposals to make sure that we're proposing something really valuable from our side and that we're really giving them meaningful assistance and not just, whatever they ask for or whatever seems to be the template these days for consulting. And then once the program starts, as I'm, starting to work with the other R&D engineers and executing something, whether it be early business strategy, where we're pulling Mike in on internal meetings to help out with crafting business models and long-term strategies to get to 10, 15-year goals, that can happen pretty often. On the other side of things, if it's more research-based, Mike will jump in and again be a voice for the client, sort of being that advocate on the client's behalf to our team and saying, I know you guys are focusing your research here, but don't forget that the client really cares about something over in this sector, so you need to be incorporating that. So Mike's a really good balancing voice for us. And as the program continues into later phases 1 and 2, sometimes I'll continue on or hand off to the human factors team, which is also something that I have a lot of experience in. But Mike and I stay on and we're talking regulatory and business strategy and infusing the program with that long term.
Yeah, and no two clients are the same, right? So we, generally speaking, we're probably around 50-50 in terms of, working with a major strategic company like Abbott or Boston Scientific. And then more entrepreneurial companies. And generally what you find is that the major strategics, they don't obviously need the business consulting help. They've come in with a clear idea of holes in the market and where they need to fit. But generally they need a lot of help on the design front, right? So take a walk around an operating room and look at some of the UIs that you see, and it's pretty clear that they haven't spent the resources there, more so than just checking the box. Whereas on the entrepreneurial side, for pre-commercial companies, I think there is a little bit more of a need, to bring in some of the market access and the business model consulting in addition to the design.
Okay, great. So quickly, I just want to make sure we get the definition of what we're even talking about today. Human-centered value proposition. So what does that mean to you? What should we be thinking of when we hear that phrase? So who wants to go with that? Kate, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I think when I think about human-centered value props, it's a twofold perspective. So one is that every value proposition you create should be done through the same process that you would a medical device, which is a human-centered design approach. It's an approach that, it must consider functionality. It has to hit all the right points and check all the right boxes. You also have to be considering your audience. And so you need a value proposition that has been that is considerate of the different stakeholders, the different perspectives that you're going to be talking to, because ultimately for a value prop, your audience are your users. So that's sort of the one perspective. Then on the other perspective, human-centered design is itself a value proposition. And a lot of folks will say, usability is not a value prop, but I would argue that it is. And the reason I say that is not just usability, it's things like, priorities. Different people will have different priorities. And if you're solving a problem, but it turns out that problem is pretty low on the priority totem pole, you can get reimbursement, but that doesn't mean you're going to get adoption. So really what we're talking about today is how do you think about the environment, the constraints, the cognitive abilities of the people that you're working with, the physical abilities, and ensuring that you are also aligning with not only their abilities and their values or their priorities, but really tailoring your device to those. And I know Mike probably has some additional stuff here.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, and that's a great definition, is think through all of your stakeholders, and the value proposition might be different, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you got to solve all the value propositions right out of the gate. But there's a different value prop for the physician, for the payer, for the patient, for the nurses, for the hospital administration. And to a certain extent, you should think through, how to prioritize each of those, and think through what your value proposition is based on the stakeholder.
Yeah.
Okay, so oh yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Kate. So I've been thinking a lot about. We had a prep discussion where we talked about some of the things that were on your mind when it comes to this topic, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting that not a lot of people, that people think about, but I don't know how much they plan for at the early stages, is kind of this idea of generational design. It's more, I think it's, and for many companies, if you're a more mature company, it's one thing, but for, from these early companies, like they're just trying to get the product out and put something out there and prove that it works. And then they'll figure out their Gen 2 later or whatever. There are other people who are much more thoughtful about it. So maybe we could just start off with just kind of this idea of a generational strategy. So what are some of the things that you think about when it comes to just generally the topic of a generational design strategy, and how, how you can think about reducing the barriers for adoption over time as you have a generational strategy, what even a generational strategy means, because, you might start off in a super small ecosystem somewhere with like that really, passionate stakeholder or somebody who is going to use it, but they're going to pay something different. So let's talk just generally about generational strategies. And then we can kind of get into, cost and how that might evolve over time. But let me start off with Kate on this. So, what do you think about for a generational strategy? And what should companies be thinking about in how they approach the market?
Certainly. I think the perspective that you come to when you're thinking about how many generations and what's going to be incorporated in each generation is going to differ based on your go-to-market strategy. So for instance, but ultimately what you're looking at is the very first thing, whether it's, you're calling it beta or MVP, minimum viable product. The goal here is to say, okay, what's going to work for us to get our foot in the door in the market, and what is it that people care about that we know is at a baseline, we're going to have a positive impact right off the bat. And then, what's financially reasonable for us as a company. And so you're kind of taking the business driver of time to market and cost of getting to market, and then making sure that it's not usurping or completely ignoring the human-centered aspect of this, which is, are people going to care about this once it gets to market? So that's like that first generation needs to start off with those two potentially conflicting things in mind and use integrative strategies that are going to find a solution that really meets both needs rather than choosing one over the other. So that I think that's the way I think about that first generation. And from there, you have to consider flexibility. You have to think about the fact that this next generation might not just be, all right, now let's slap a sensor on it and have an app. Maybe it's something where you actually need to say the design of this first gen is going to change, dramatically for the second gen features to be incorporated. And we need to make sure that those things are going to be acceptable for both the initial early adopters, as well as the new group of people that are going to be bringing this in or incorporating this as you start to expand and tap more of your accessible market.
And Mike, let me just bring you into this too, just a little bit. So, when you think about business model, relative to what Kate was just saying, go-to-market strategy, business model, is it advisable to, what do you advise people when you think about this first gen product? Because it is a trade-off, right? You have to trade off, adoption and showing that something works versus being all the features that all these other people maybe later want. So maybe let's just start there. First of all, with business model, what do you advise people? Let's start that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally speaking, it's be realistic, right? And on the hierarchy of needs, I think number one is still safety and efficacy, right? So, your device has to come through. You want to get it into clinical trials as soon as you can, so that you can prove out safety and efficacy, right? But then realize who that Gen 1 market is. I think when I see market models, where you'll take a look at the accessible market and, you'll have decided that it's X number of cases per year, in the US and at a COGS of Y, that's giving you a market of, $500 million or whatever it is, right? But that's not the accessible market, right? And especially for that Gen 1 device, it's going to be a much smaller cohort of that market, right? And generally speaking, when your first generation device, it's early adopters. There's going to be some parts of the design that are a little bit difficult to use. You're not going to have the distribution model. And it's not going to appeal to a lot of centers beyond maybe major academic centers, right? And I think there's one of these things where, the early designs, you're working with KOLs, because you're trying to understand what the device is going to look like, what the procedure looks like. And and you're trying to leverage those KOLs essentially as your evangelists, right? So there's a lot of reasons why you use KOLs. But then that means your market is pretty much limited to KOLs, right? Like there's going to be, generally speaking, a smaller initial audience that can handle sort of the nuances of the design and that can push through a lot of the hurdles that you're going to encounter from, hospital purchasing and hospital administration and whatnot, right? So, and that's fine, right? Because you still have that initial hurdle of safety and efficacy. But then what you should think through is what are those hurdles, right? So, all right, so once I get into this initial market and it's not $50 million, it's $50 million. Fine. Now, what are the next big hurdles to clear, right? Is it improving the design? Is it improving the distribution model? Is it looking at bundling, what have you, right? So, to go from that 50 million to the 500 million, identify what the biggest hurdles are, and then incorporate that into your generational plan.
It strikes me as I'm thinking about what we're talking about here, that people have to raise money, right? That startups to succeed have to raise capital, and that capital is usually going to come from someone who's at the super early stages, is not all that sophisticated usually in healthcare. They just want to see things get out there and prove they work, and traction, and MVP. They talk about MVPs and stuff that in a way that not everybody in healthcare does. So, and Ximedica, by the way, was a venture-backed company that just got acquired by Veranex, right? So, you guys know what I'm talking about. You got to prove something and then show how you can scale and do all those things and return capital. So just quickly, thinking about kind of that from that perspective, what advice do you give those super early companies to say, look, you're in this early stage, you're gonna, you need to show something in this first gen, right? You need to prove something. Is it going to just, do you advise them to go to just like that small KOL group and it doesn't matter what the cost is and all those things, just show that it works? Or, I guess, how would you advise people who are listening to this that, in a way that's thoughtful, that planning down the road, what should they be doing at these early stages to be able to unlock capital in future rounds? Because I know you've got a lot of insights here. So, so both of you, I'd love some of your thoughts on, and in that first gen, what do people really need to prove when it comes to value?
Well, one of the first things I would say, honestly, is that Mike mentioned safety and efficacy, and clinical trials come in first. And clinical trials are an excellent opportunity to add research. A lot of folks are looking at clinical trials as a feasibility opportunity. It's to say, does it work? Do the clinicians, actually complete the process? What are the outcomes of the porcine model patients or actual patients if you're doing true first in human? Any sort of use where you're working in anatomy, even if it's non-human, you can bring in research, and the goal is that satisfies your investors in a way that shows a real clinician using a real device on a real body, whatever that body may be. But then you bring in researchers to understand, okay, based on what we've seen, there's a lot of changes that need to be made to this thing over time, and they can help you, again, align with your generational plan at that really early stage and say, great, we've done the clinical trials, but we also now have all these research insights about the environment, the process, the workflow, the efficiency, the inefficiency, all of these things, the usability, the lack of usability, all of those things can then be inputs to design iterations without having to tell the investors, wait, just be patient, because we all know that that's not usually a thing that they're very good at. So it's a good way to kind of, meet both needs at the same time.
Yeah, and by the way, that's a really good point, and I'm sure Mike wants to jump in here too, but it's a really good point on collecting other things that maybe you don't need necessarily, for approval at this point in time, but this is stuff that you can give both to your design team and developers, but also investors and others, and say, look, we were able to also prove these other things in the process. Mike, you want to add any comments before I move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the product that you're working on, but I kind of feel like seed and A rounds are generally about, to me, I'd be interested in your opinion on this too, Paul. But I feel like seed and A rounds are about selling the dream and building the picture of how this device is going to impact populations. And I love getting early clinical data, even if that's 10 or 15 patients, feasibility data on an MVP product that may never even be the commercial incarnation, right? And so, but something to help sell the dream. And then I feel like B rounds and later are about selling the business, right? And really picking, saying like, okay, now we've shown you the dream, now this is the pathway for this to be a viable commercial product. This is how we're going to get COGS down, and we're going to hit a certain margin, so that you build that ramp to exit. So there's sort of, I feel like MVP, doesn't even necessarily need to be your commercial product, but it should start selling the dream. And then as you, run through your financing rounds, now you should start thinking about how's this going to be manufactured, how are we going to start knocking down those hurdles into some of those other physician groups, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up too, because when I think about investors, and I think, which I do a lot, I know that companies will design their value prop sometimes based on what they think the investor is looking for, at least when they're pitching the investors, and maybe even when they start, after their funding. But there's so many other stakeholders that are out there that they have to satisfy. And just because the investors like it doesn't mean this product is going to be successful. So I think, when you're thinking about the needs of the different stakeholders, how do you, what's the process for doing that the right way? And kind of prioritizing features, how do you, again, what's the right way to do this? Kate.
The way that I think about pitch decks and value propositions, because, your pitch deck often is pretty much made of your value proposition ultimately. You should have as many pitch decks and as many different value propositions as you have stakeholders. A lot of times what we see is businesses that they spend a lot of time thinking about the investors, in the A series, like the angels, right? These folks were, again, they're interested in the dream, they're interested in the well-being of the population. And those investors even are different than the B and C investors. And yet the same pitch deck is recycled and used over and over again. A lot of people get too technical with their pitch decks and their value propositions. What you're really trying to tell is a story that resonates with the people that you're talking to. And that's going to be very different across different people. So just like a business model, you go from one stage to the next, you go from one person to the next. Sometimes you have to crumple it up, throw it in the trash and get a whole new one. And that can be painful when such good thought was gone, was put into the initial one. But you have to be willing to acknowledge that in a dynamic company, your value propositions will be dynamic as much as your design will be dynamic, and everything has to evolve with each generation. You can't just sort of stay stagnant.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just build on that, right? To say, when you're in your design phase, right? Think about all those stakeholders early. And when they should be incorporated into the design, right? Because a lot of times it's going to be easier and cheaper to do all that design work up front, right? Even if you're not addressing those stakeholders, right? If you're designing a big piece of capital equipment, it probably makes sense to think about how it's going to be stored in the hospital, how it's going to work in the workflow of the OR, even if that's not your initial population, just because it's going to be much more painful to introduce those design elements later, right? So, to a certain extent, I think it's just doing the work up front, to think through what all the hurdles are going to be, and does it make sense to put that in Gen 1 or Gen 3? And it's going to change depending on, what your product is.
And when you talk about involving all those different stakeholders, right? A lot of people gravitate right to the KOLs because they're the sexy ones who are going to give the podium presentations and be your champion, perhaps. But what about all those other people, right? There's the people who are, the techs and the nurses and all the other people who are involved in actually, bringing these products to the patient. And so just quickly, like, as you said, Mike, you get involved in all these other other stakeholders. Do you do that from the very beginning? Do you go around and interview all the other people in the workflow, or does that come later?
As early as humanly possible.
Kate, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I was going to say as early as humanly possible. For me, it's all about talking. If your device is going to be used by a patient, stop talking to a KOL after the first couple opinions you get, and then start talking to patients about what they might eventually need. Community hospital X. You should be in all sorts of different facilities and clinics. Depending on the indication, it's going to be used at home. Visit patient homes. Do ethnography. Do contextual inquiry. And it sounds biased coming from a researcher, but there's a real financial benefit to it. If you invest, a couple $100,000 up front on really thorough research and strategy for that long-term development plan, you can cut out tons of costs, not only in later usability testing and things like that, but change orders, engineering change orders that happen in phase 2 are way more expensive than design changes that happen in phase 0. So the more you can do up front, the more money you're going to save yourself long-term. And then once you hit market, you're even going to drastically increase immediate adoption, because even though that may not be exactly where you were headed, somebody from Community Hospital X might hear about it, be able to use it immediately, and you're going to get sort of a bigger revenue stream than you even predicted right up front.
Yeah, no, really good points. I think a lot too about, there's the community hospitals and, what they can handle and what their business models will tolerate versus the academic centers where a lot of the studies are often done. Do people even, is there a way, so, you could do research, maybe you could do I guess my question is, like, do you do your early work in the academic centers, but be doing your research in the community centers, or can you even do some of your early work with your first gen product in the community center? Is that even a good idea? Mike.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth at least understanding their opinion, right? I think when you're doing, I'd be interested in Kate's opinion on this as well. I think it's worth doing the research there when you're doing sort of the early clinical work. It like everything, it depends, right? It depends on the product. I tend to gravitate towards, in those early trials, making sure that you get a positive result, right? So, nothing's going to harm your value like a negative clinical result. And I feel, and this might just be my bias coming from a big company, but I feel like academic centers, with a lot more staff and highly specialized physicians, generally, give you the best chance of success. And that's probably overly conservative. But from doing early clinical work, I tend to gravitate still towards the big centers, but I certainly would get the opinions and do the research with community hospitals, et cetera.
And just to jump in on that, I would say that, so there's the interesting thing about experts and novices, and technically everybody that you talk to is going to be a novice for your device because it's brand new and it's yours. But when you think about the KOLs, I do consider them experts oftentimes. And when I think about community hospital physicians, some of them might be experts, some of them might not be. So there is some inconsistency that Mike's hitting upon, where that inconsistency could be problematic for some of the outcomes. But if you interview the clinicians from smaller, less well-funded hospitals, you can find the experts there as well. But the cool thing about, even if you don't include them in your trials formally, getting people to work with that device, having it be a different type of trial, or again, having them do animal trials with it instead of human trials. If you're not in a really great place where you can trust those maybe less experienced or sort of clinicians who are less used to these really novel kind of mule type devices as opposed to the Mustangs that you bring to the market, those people can still show you different errors, because experts are going to make a lot of errors, and a lot of errors are going to be from things like negative transfer, which is basically, on the Titan device or on the Mako, you do this to complete this step, to do the planning, and on your device, I can't find it, right? So the expert's going to have this mental model that's really well developed from your competitors or predecessors. Whereas if you look at a novice, they're not going to necessarily have those mental models. They're going to be making different mistakes. And so if you want to mitigate the opportunity and the risk associated with both of those types of mistakes, you should see those people use it as early as possible. And then the question just becomes, how do you use those data that you get, and who's included in the formal trials versus who's maybe more in your, we'll say, secondary or tertiary studies.
So let's go back here to business model again for a second. Mike, you mentioned this idea of accessible markets before. So I just want to unpack that a little bit here again. So, a business model, we see that first pitch. Kate mentioned, you should have 7 different pitch decks or 8, whatever number of pitch decks you have for stakeholders. So there's a lot of pitch decks, a lot of people panicking right now who are creating pitch decks, I'm sure, who are listening to this. But I advise the same thing. I say have different pitch decks for different audiences, even different types of investors. I'm like a different angel deck versus a VC. And, you have different, it's fine to have different decks. You got to keep track of them and update them. But that's a whole nother business opportunity. Let's focus on the business model itself. So, is a business model static, Mike? Do you go like you figured out, as you said, my market size is this, and this is, where reimbursement is and all that. That's my business model. Are you static, or do you evolve your business model? And, and what are some strategies that companies should think about related to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to change, right? I think, that initial market, just like there's like an MVP product, there really, probably is an MVP business model, right? Which, is largely, generally, I think the easiest markets to access are direct selling to large academic centers, right? But then when you go through, your accessible market size and look at all the hurdles, some of those are going to be barriers to adoption based on the product. They have less staff, they've got less, busier hospitals, less room in less storage room, et cetera. And some of them are going to be business model driven, right? And some of the things to generally think about are, they've got a lot going on, and ease of doing business is a big issue, right? So things like bundled contracts drive a lot of access into hospitals, even for inferior products, just because it's simpler for them to deal with one vendor, and just buying a single product, no matter how fantastic it is from an efficacy standpoint, it's just difficult to do, right? So thinking through how you might bundle your device, that's generally through a distributor, which may mean, not may mean, it does mean you're going to earn a lower margin because you're giving away a lot of that to the distributor. But in terms of volume, it's probably worth it, right? And particularly from an exit standpoint, I think if you can show that you've got a larger volume base, it's generally easier to make that case when it does come time to exit. So the business model is going to change. I think bundling is worth thinking through, and then market access, right? And how you're going to scale your sales, whether that's through a distributor or if it's going to be something where you're going to go to a direct sales force.
Okay, and Kate, something that I found really interesting, and we were talking earlier, was this idea of trade-offs that people make in their process, and a lot of what you do in your job is exploring trade-offs. So maybe you could dig into that a little bit for us, in terms of what these different stakeholders are and what kind of trade-offs should people be thinking about. So explain to us kind of what that means and how you do that, how you use trade-offs in your process.
Definitely. I think this type, we can talk abstractly about this, but I think that some sort of concrete narrative I'll try to build around this. Obviously examples from a consultant have to be a little bit redacted, but we'll see what we can work through here. So we recently had a client that I was working with they were very much a young company. I think they were about 25 people strong, very much in the R&D phase, and they were trying to figure out what their reimbursement would be, but then also try to figure so what features they needed for reimbursement. But there was a very clear conflict between what the payers and the hospital were interested in, which was more efficiency to increase throughput, and what the clinicians were interested in, which was a device that was more, I would say, that allowed them to think less about a couple of different tasks, right? So it was, this device could remove burden from the clinician, or it could have a couple of features that sped up the case a little bit. And so you're now at this really interesting juncture where your clinicians are oftentimes the people in good hospitals and in more hospitals. The docs get to try out, the nurses get to try out, the techs get to try out whatever it is that purchasing is thinking about bringing in. And I've had several clients where they say, oh yeah, no, we tried X and we tried Y, and we're definitely not going with Y because we didn't like it. And so if the docs won't use it, then oftentimes, regardless of reimbursement or models, the hospital won't buy it, or they'll take the doc's recommendation, all things being equal or price being relatively similar. So oftentimes you have to figure out, go into hospitals and talk about, for this type of device that I have as a startup, who's often making the decisions, and to go to multiple hospitals and find that out in multiple types of hospitals and say, okay, the research we're doing is not just what do payers care about and what do doctors care about, it's now great. And then who has the clout across the types of facilities that we're trying to get into. If you're doing blood collection and it's, phlebotomists really don't like something, but Quest Labs purchasing system, Quest Diagnostics purchasing system wants this thing because it's cheaper, Quest is the person you're catering to, right? The phlebotomists working at a Quest don't have that type of clout. But if you're talking about ICU nurses, they have the power to say no to your device. And you have to really think about them and their needs as much, if not more so, than the hospital purchasing groups.
So, one of the questions from one of our companies that is following up on what you're just talking about, Kate, are these metrics that payers, let's say, care about versus the ones that the provider cares about? And as a small company, what's the best practice for vetting these metrics, let's say for payers specifically? So how does a company then come in and frame the conversation with the payer to figure those things out?
Yes. So the good news is that there are some universal priorities in healthcare, not, safety and efficacy. Great. Yes, absolutely. But one of the nice things is that regardless of the product that you're creating, compliance and adherence are universally accepted by payers, it benefits everybody. It benefits absolutely everyone. So if you can come in and make an argument that, regardless of whether or not it increases efficiency, regardless of whether or not it improves the clinician's caregiving experience, it will increase compliance with the patient later on, or it will increase compliance for the clinicians, and it'll prevent them from getting cited by JCO, for not doing, for not warming contrast, for instance. It's such a pain. If you can say that this is something that is usable and that will support more so than the other competitive products, maybe it's the same price and similar efficacy, but yours is going to be more help to increase compliance, everybody wins in that sense. So they're like the way that I think about payers is that they need to see compliance, like CPAP's a good example, right? If it's not, you can say, okay, this person clearly has sleep apnea, and we're going to give them the CPAP, but we're not going to reimburse them or you for it if they don't use it appropriately. And so there are plenty of people who fail out of CPAP because they're just not compliant with it. So that's one thing that I tend to focus on when talking to anybody. That's your baseline is, yes, it's safe. Yes, it's efficacious. We've done our benchmarking. We've done our, non-inferiority studies. But we've also looked at usability in a way and adoption in a way that supports that this will be more easily integrated, more easily adopted. And oftentimes, things like effect size, things like doctor priorities or values that may be conflicting, everyone can kind of come to this bipartisan agreement on the things that seem to matter universally across healthcare.
And one of the things I would add, one of the things that I always advise companies, we talked about those early feasibility trials, and those are gold, right? So you have to do them. You have to collect your safety and efficacy data, or even at the feasibility stage, understand where you're at. But you can double and triple those studies up on, we already talked about collecting as much usability data as you can, but you should certainly try to collect as many economic endpoints as you can as well, because you're essentially getting it for free, right? So you're already studying those patients. And so whatever, think through what the economic metric is going to be. Things that tend to work really well are reducing readmission rates, reducing hospital stays. If it's something like that, reducing the number of staff in the room, there's likely stuff that you can collect easily, even if it's only on 10 or 20 patients, but that can guide, when you do get to your pivotal trial, I would definitely collect, by that point, you should have an idea of what your economic story is. And I would definitely collect, those economic endpoints as well, whatever those might be.
Speaking of economics, I want to back up a little bit and go back up to just as we said before, business model, cost, pricing. It's something that I know a lot of companies struggle with is trying to figure out what's the right price for, the market, ultimately, whatever that market is. But to your point earlier, Mike, there's a lot of these different accessible markets that, you're going to have over time and kind of concentric circles of how that's going to expand maybe over time. So, Kate, I just want to back up to just generally speaking, designing for value versus designing for cost and kind of, again, this idea of a generational strategy. Can you have different prices at different times? I know the cost is going to go down, hopefully, with volume and other things over time. So, maybe speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, there's certainly nothing wrong with within, as Mike said early on, he's, being realistic and saying, okay, we can't do it for anything more than this certain COGS or if the bomb's more than this, we really can't go there. So there's nothing wrong with setting boundaries for yourself. But then when you're figuring out where in a certain space, where within a certain spectrum you should be, I think one of the things I hate to add another variable to these things when companies are already struggling to figure out the sweet spot. But the reality is that some of the more expensive features when you're making something are also the things that are going to actually increase your volumes later. And so for instance, if you were to say, I have a product and the first version, as we said, it's going to be used by KOLs only, and it's going to be kind of hard to use. And then the argument is, well, should we make it really well designed and thoughtful and usable and have clear affordances in Gen 1 or Gen 2? Well, what are your volumes? What sort of targets are you going for? If your difference between Gen, the MVP and really Gen 2 or Gen, I consider Gen 1 after MVP, but we'll not number these. So the first thing you do is very difficult to use. The second thing could still be difficult, or it could be made easier sooner. A lot of what I find is that cognitive load is, you guys are familiar with the triple aim probably, but there's a large number of hospitals that are adopting the quadruple aim, which in addition to the primary three things that hospitals are thinking about, they're adding on clinician cognitive resources and the experience of providing care. Because ultimately, just like time and money and personnel, glucose in the brain is a finite resource that you only have so much of. And so what we're finding more and more is that hospitals and the FDA and payers are becoming aware of this idea that if your device is just one more thing that they have to think about rather than something they don't actually have to think about and can still use, then you're going to get much less resistance to the regulatory acceptance to adoption in the market. And so the more you can figure out that the seemingly expensive things that you're doing to improve the design in Gens 2 and 3 are actually going to set you up for greater success later on, the better. And you can make a financial argument for things like usability, for things like cognitive load early on that will help your investors understand what it is they're actually paying for, rather than just saying, well, this one costs 17 cents more and we think it'll be nicer or more acceptable for the doctors. It's like, no, this is really going to touch upon resources and hospitals' business modeling.
Yeah, that's awesome. What I would add from the business perspective is that to a certain extent it depends on if your device is going to be a price setter or a price taker, right? So if you're coming into a busy market with 4 competitors, you pretty much have to play, so you're dealing with set dollars from a reimbursement standpoint. And then you might think of your economic argument as a competitive advantage, right? So, that's sort of one side of things. If it's a new to the world device, where you think you're going to get a separate reimbursement code for it and you're a market setter or a price setter, the one thing I always caution is it's going to be super hard to get a price uplift later, right? So, take a look at all the things that Kate just laid out in terms of making your economic argument, and honestly try to set the price high because it's only going to get hammered downwards, right? So one, it's going to be hard to come back, even if you get extended indications to get a price uplift from CMS later, and competition is going to come into the market, right? So things are always going to drive the price down. So, take a holistic look at everything Kate just said, and really aim, to, be reasonable, but try to get, the highest price you can at the outset.
So from a tactical perspective, I just want to cover a couple things here in the 10 minutes or so we have left in the live broadcast. So let's talk, maybe we'll flip all this on its head for a moment and just say, let's talk about mistakes, redact company names, but just, from a practical matter, you've been involved with all sorts of devices and technologies in general. So, maybe thinking back, reflecting on some things that went wrong in this particular context that we're talking about here. Where did they make mistakes in terms of the stakeholder evaluations, the process, what didn't they consider? What didn't they do? Did a company, not include, cloud connectivity until it was too late, or maybe they did it too soon, or whatever? What are some mistakes that you've seen some people make that our companies can take away practically here to say, we shouldn't do that? So maybe just some concrete examples without, again, heavily redacting, so no one knows who we're talking about. But just generally speaking, what are some mistakes that people should avoid? So I'll start with you, Kate.
The one thing I can think about recently, so there was a client who's, another fairly young company. I'm trying to pull, examples that are salient for you guys. I was on the first sales call with them and explained my process and explained what design research was and sort of, what we could offer. And the CEO stopped and he paused and he said, I don't want to insult you, but it sounds like we're just paying you to come up to speed. and we're already there. We already know, like, we're all set. We don't want to pay you this much money to just get to our level, right? And the thing that I think a lot of companies miss is that they know, like you guys have a lot of incredible expertise. A lot of you are clinicians, you're coming from deep science backgrounds. Like, there's nothing that we could say that would diminish your expertise. But what often happens is, you know what's going on, but you don't know why it's happening or why people want it. So what happens that I see most often in this particular case, it was a company who went through the process. They were like, we have KOLs, we already know what's happening in hospitals, we're all set. We're not going to use design research up front, we're good. So they go through the process of the regular engineering R&D and the industrial design, and they get to a point where they're starting to bring it out for usability testing. They're starting to bring it out to, their sales reps, are starting to poke at the more, the less tapped areas of the accessible market. And people start saying, oh, well, I want this and I want that, and I want these things. And they can, just like the KOLs, like they've made design choices based on people saying, I want this. The KOL in this case, let's say that we're talking about a device that is used for laparoscopic surgery, and they say, I want a tool that can do the following. I want a tool that looks like this and does X, right? Well, it turns out that they didn't want a tool that looked like that and did X. The reason they wanted that is because they were struggling to use another tool to do the same thing. And so what happened was, this company had added a whole new tool and hadn't really solved the problem, because the other tool they had sort of neglected or moved on from, because, well, we're going to do this tool instead. It really would have been better if they understood why people were asking for that change. Why do people want to change? Well, because this thing is too difficult to use. And so really a redesign of that difficult thing would have A, saved a bunch of money and saved a bunch of time, and B, led to a much happier group once you got out into the field and started talking to the broader population. Because now no one knows why these KOLs asked for this new tool, but no one has a model for the new tool, and the new tool isn't working either for the same thing, because it's not meeting the same needs. So a lot of times it's really, there's a great book you can read called Start With Why. So if you're interested in that type of thing, it's one of those books that gets repetitive partway through, as all these things do. But if you want to learn about sort of the underlying, it's not what your users want, it's why they want it. And that will inform the best mitigations, the best solutions, and the best design choices.
And just, from a practical matter, companies, to do, you've got training in this area, you've been doing this for most of your career, Kate. So is this something that, like, a company, hires you to come in and do just this initial kind of research? Can they do this at any phase along in the process? And if they can't afford your Ximedica's resources yet, are there other ways they can do this? As you mentioned in the book, are there other resources that people can apply this to in a way that, they can do at any stage, I guess is the question.
Always. Yeah. So, it's never too early to do research, which is very much true. There's definitely too late. There's a time to stop having ideas, because again, they get increasingly expensive as the time goes on. Oftentimes when folks will, if you're into phase 3, you're kind of in tooling already, but this is Gen 1, bring somebody in and say, great, look, Gen 1's done. You're not going to change Gen 1. It's out, it's going to head out, it's going to go into the offices, it's going to go into the patient homes. But we'd like to use you now that we have our new revenue stream to help us figure out Gen 2 and check our generational plan to see what might need to change for that. And we don't want to be a burden to companies. There's no winning situation where we propose some absurdly expensive thing that they're not sure they can afford or want. It's really about saying, what are your needs that you're aware of? What are needs that we can identify that you've not identified yet, and creating more of a partnership long term, where there's a trusting dialogue that we're not going to bid on everything you ask us to do, because some of it might not be useful. And we're also going to work to help you understand where our expertise may sometimes supplement yours. So I think that there's, timing wise, if you can do it now, and I say now, assuming you haven't done it already, do it now. And if it's something where you're looking to, in between generations, really start some exploration, then that's another time to bring in design research. And again, formative usability tests are also a good way to, at least at the very bare minimum, get rid of, de-risk some of the tasks that may be problematic if it's not from a marketing perspective, and just from a safety perspective as well.
And what should people be thinking about in terms of site of care? Because we've been talking about, maybe different, hospitals being community centers or academic centers, but what about moving from, a hospital to, an ambulatory center or to a home for that matter? Is that something that, we incorporate into the same kind of a research process?
Absolutely. There is so contextual inquiry and ethnography are my two preferred methods of research. Ethnography being like long form shadowing, where you're basically a fly on the wall, just sort of following around people who agree to let you follow them around. And you can do that for days, you can do it for weeks. And on the other hand, contextual inquiry is something where you would go into a patient home, for instance, for 2 to 4 hours, watch them use, I don't know, a home infusion device or a home dialysis machine, see what their current experience is, understand, the more dynamic the environment, the more research you want to do. And I say that I think the patient home is the most dynamic environment because you can be in everything from a 400 square foot apartment in the projects of the Bronx, and you can be in a mansion by, the seaside in Florida, and both of those people can be using the same device. And that's sort of what's amazing to me is that you do need to consider both of those use cases. And so I actually would say that the less controlled the environment, the more research you should do to understand what are the potential issues and what are the vastly different needs of these different populations.
And Mike, let me go to you for the same kind of question here, because we've got only about 4 more minutes to go. So same thing about, mistakes or things that you think that people don't do that you wish they would do. Where could we save them time and pain in terms of this thinking? So any advice you have from, again, drawing on your own experience, something you would say, don't do this, don't do that. You can give us a couple of those kinds of examples.
Sure. There's always an element of Monday morning quarterbacking here, right? But I think, you really shouldn't skimp on the usability, particularly as the device gets more complicated, right? Or, as the device gets, quote unquote riskier, right? If you're designing a bandage, you probably don't need to put as much effort into usability as, a cardiac procedure, right? And the watch out that I always give is MitraClip. I think, fabulous therapy, the opportunity in mitral valve disease is huge. But it initially failed or missed its primary endpoint early on until they started to focus on expert centers and centers that had done, I think it was something like 150 procedures, which from a commercial standpoint is hard to do because, at least early on, you don't have centers with that kind of volume. And, and a lot of that was just driven by it's a really insanely complicated device to use, until you really understand it. And so, again, it is what it is. It's, there's a certain amount of Monday morning quarterbacking here. But you would say like, all right, if you had done, the time early on at revving that design and, improving the usability of it, theoretically you wouldn't have this constraint now, right? Where you can only focus on expert centers. You got to weigh everything with time to market and, the cost of doing a rev and whatnot. So, it is a complicated business decision, but I think that was one, in particular where the complexity of the device, ended up, at least in, in a missed trial. And to Abbott's credit, they continued investing in it, and and now it's the success that it is. But that I think was a case where the usability was an issue, at least at the outset.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. We have a company in MedTech Innovator's portfolio, Moray Medical, who just developed a system for delivering MitraClip better, so that anyone can do it, and you don't have to be super expert to handle that complexity. So you're right on point on that. All right, so as I said, there's only a couple minutes left to wrap up here for this first hour, and then we're going to stay on for Q&A with the cohort. But last thoughts as we're kind of wrapping up. Number one, how do people contact you? How do they find Kate and Mike out there in the universe? Is that on LinkedIn? And any final thoughts that you might want to share for people, again, about what they should be thinking about, how they should, it could be advice for a book to read, again, like Kate did, anything that you want to share for people here in closing, reflecting back on this conversation. So I'll start with you, Kate.
LinkedIn's great. Email is also great. I'm happy to send Paul our emails. I think he has them, and he can forward them to you as well. But really excited to reach out, to have you guys reach out and to be able to answer questions. We're not going to nickel and dime you for just sort of one-offs, and we're really happy. We really do enjoy the mentorship aspect of this. It's great for us to see the folks succeed just through the experiences that we've had as well. I think, as far as final thoughts, the biggest mistake that I see people make is really trivializing what they view as squishy or fluffy science. And what I'll say, qualitative research, and it's all based, if you're doing it correctly, it's not market research, it's not VOC. You can call it a lot of things, but the really good design research is following excellent scientific method. It's really working to analyze data in a controlled way. It's not just saying, somebody wanted this and somebody else wanted that, I guess we'll just do both. It can seem like that on the outside, and our job oftentimes is to make conversations look very casual, but all of the session guides that researchers create are very deliberate. And so whether it's us or somebody else that you're working with, include them as an engineer, include them as a member of the team, rather than saying, we'll bring in the marketing fluff later. And so that's also the thing, is don't trivialize it, not because it's my career, but just because it's really well thought out, and good professionals are very good at what they do. So try to take the moment of being humble and looking at a discipline that's different than your own, and say, maybe this is worth the investment, maybe this is worth our time.
All right, great advice. Thank you, Kate. And for those of you who are on YouTube, just look up Kate MacNamee, MacNamee on LinkedIn. You'll find her that way. And Mike Neidert. So where do we find you? Same thing, LinkedIn. And closing thoughts.
Yeah, so LinkedIn works pretty well. My name is pretty uncommon, so if you look up Mike Neidert, chances are you'll find me. Or reach out to Paul. Paul knows where to find me. And on last thoughts, I think this theme of thinking through your accessible market and what the hurdles are at each phase to get to that top accessible market. Doing that work up front, I know it's added work, and most startups just want to get right to building and doing. It doesn't need to take that much time, like a month or so of thinking, or 2 weeks. It'll save you in the long run. And I think, when you have that strategy to how you're going to get to, the total accessible market, that also is going to help with your exit value, right? So, when acquirers are looking at your company, if they can see, that the barriers to getting to that full accessible market requires less work from their standpoint, that's going to increase your value, right? So it is a little bit more work to do up front, but I guarantee that it's worth it.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you for both of you giving us some mindset here to think about value propositions and human-centered value propositions, and the importance of research, usability, all these things, and how it's not just something you do once and then you're done. These are things that evolve over time. These are things that, obviously there's a time and place for making design changes, to Kate's point earlier. We don't want to go in and make changes now when you're, super far along and you're in tooling, but there's a next generation to think about and all these things. So these are things to continually think about. Mike, your point on evolving business model is super interesting and really important to keep thinking about, is that, your business model is not a one and done. You're evolving your business model over time, and you need to think about that and plan that into your process. So lots of great things to think about. Ximedica is just a terrific team. I mentioned this earlier briefly, but Ximedica was acquired recently by Veranex, and I know it's a new name, a new brand out there that's also acquired Experian Group, another one of our partners on the regulatory side, and you're building a behemoth in terms of being a single source to go to for medical product, medical device, health tech, et cetera, design and development, and bringing these products to market, regulatory, and so on. So very exciting. Love having you guys as partners, and really appreciate your sharing some of your wisdom today. I know all these companies appreciate it that are out there. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to go ahead and wrap up the first hour here on YouTube. No one leave. If you're part of our cohort, or if you're our panelists here, you're going to stick around for Q&A. But for everyone else, medtechinnovator.org/live is where you can find not only this broadcast archive later, but also all of our upcoming broadcast schedule. So you can see other topics that are coming up. There's some really, really interesting ones. So take a look at medtechinnovator.org/live, as well as archives of our past broadcasts. So this is our 6th one in this series. This year, we have years and years before this as well that you can look at. And we have several other cohorts. We have our MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific cohort has its own series at medtechinnovator.org/APAC live. And we'll also have medtechinnovator.org/biotools live for our upcoming series of webinars on biotools. So lots to look at. Thanks for being here today. If you're here on YouTube,